This passage is adapted from the book Lost Discoveries, The Ancient Roots of Modern Science, from the Babylonians to the Maya by Dick Teresi. In the History of Culture, wrote mathematician Tobias Danzig in 1930, the discovery of zero will always stand out as one of the greatest single achievements of the human race. Zero, he said, marked a turning point in math, science, and industry. He also noted that the zero was invented not in the West but by the Indians in the early centuries after Christ. Negative numbers followed soon thereafter. The Maya invented zero in the New World at approximately the same time. Europe, says Danzig, did not accept zero as a number until the 12th or 13th century. There are many biographies of zero, and Danzig's concise and spirited account of the birth of a number is adequate for most of it. He sees zero's invention appearing on an Indian's counting board in, say, the 1st or 2nd century AD. The Indian counting board had columns for the ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on. To write 302, for instance, a mathematician would put a 2 in the first column and 3 in the third, leaving the second column empty. On one fateful day, as Danzig sees it, an unknown Indian drew an oval in the second column. He called it Shunya, for empty or blank. Shunyata, an important concept in Buddhism, is often translated as emptiness or void. The Arabs turned Shunya into Sifra, empty in Arabic, which became Zephyrum in Italy and eventually zero. In Germany and elsewhere, Sifra became Sifra and then in English, cipher. In other words, it took over 1,000 years for Western civilization to accept a number for nothing. Danzig blames the Greeks. The concrete mind of the ancient Greeks could not conceive the void as a number, let alone endow the void with a symbol. That's the short version and not a bad one. You don't want to hear the long version, so let's suffice with the medium-sized tale. Zero lay rustling in the weeds for many centuries before that Indian drew it on a counting board. It was an unnamed, unwritten force. It took many more centuries after the Indians and the Maya dared speak its name before zero was promoted to a full-fledged number. The US Library of Congress defends our calendar and it's missing zero. There has never been a system of recording reigns, dynasties, or eras, the library states, that did not designate its first year as the year one. In fact, the Maya had both years zero and days zero. The Babylonians had no zero, but they knew something was wrong. If they numbered the first year of each king's reign as year one, then added up the number of years of each separate reign, they'd end up with too many years unless each king died just before midnight on New Year's Eve and his successor took the throne after midnight. Thus, the Babylonians called the king's first year the accession year. The following year was year one. The accession year was a kind of year zero. The Babylonians, so far as we know, never articulated zero, but seemed aware that there was a missing number in their system. The contemporary mathematician who has conducted the most rigorous research on nothing is Robert Kaplan, the author of The Nothing That Is, A Natural History of Zero. Zero turns up throughout history in different cultures as a series of dots and circles. And Kaplan writes of following the swarm of dots we find in writings from a host of languages across great spans of time and on topics mathematical and otherwise. Kaplan traces the roots of zero to Sumer and Babylonia. The Sumerians counted by tens and sixties, a system adopted by the Babylonians who eclipsed them in Mesopotamia. The Babylonians, far ahead of the Romans and Greeks to come, imposed a positional notation on the old Sumerian sexagesimal system. Writing their numbers on clay, the Babylonians needed a symbol to put in the empty columns, just as we today use zero to differentiate between 302 and 32. Somewhere between the 6th and 3rd centuries BC, the Babylonians began using two slanted tag-like symbols to insert in the empty columns. They borrowed the slanty tags from their language, where they were used as periods, among other things. However, the Babylonians used their zero only in the middle of numbers, never at the end. Clearly, this was not a full-fledged zero. Kaplan argues that when Alexander invaded the Babylonian Empire in 331 BC, he hauled off zero along with the gold. Shortly thereafter, we find the symbol zero in the papyri of Greek astronomers, but the mathematicians never pursued the concept. According to the passage, the Babylonians and Indian civilization were similar in that they both wrote zero using tack-like symbols, referred to their rulers' first year in power as the Ascension year, derived their names for zero from their respective religions, used a symbol for zero in the middle of numbers. So it's not B, that's just Babylonians. So Babylonians began using two slanted tack-like symbols to insert in the empty columns. And they drew an oval in the second. So they both used symbols in the middle of numbers. As presented in the second paragraph, the story of an unknown person drawing an oval on a counting board is best described as 12 to 25. He sees zero's invention appearing on an Indian's counting board in, say, the 1st or 2nd century AD. He called it Shunya. On one fateful day, an unknown Indian drew an oval in the second column. Okay, a factual account from a document Danzig discovered. A factual account from ancient Indian writings, Danzig's theory for how historic invention occurred, Kaplan's theory of how it occurred. So it's it's Danzig's theory. This is something that he imagines must have happened in India as the Indian discovered, or rather invented, or rather wrote zero in the second column, right? So it was his theory. According to the passage, the Maya invented zero at about the same time as the Indians invented zero, the Sumerians invented zero, Alexander invaded Babylonia, and Europe accepted zero. So it's the same time as the Indians. The Maya invented zero in the New World at approximately the same time as the Indians. So that is option A. As used in line 21, the phrase fateful day most nearly refers to a day that was this one, right? On one fateful day, when, this unknown Indian drew an oval in the second column. So this would be momentous, right? Momentous is something which is important, which is historic, right? So that is what fateful day means in the context of zero. Not unfortunate, not ominous. Ominous is something that, holds the possibility of danger, and not foretold. It wasn't something that was known beforehand. According to the passage in Germany, the word for zero became in Germany, right? That was here. In Germany and elsewhere, it became Cifra. And in English, it became cipher. So it was Cifra. In the passage, Danzig criticizes the ancient Greeks because he thinks they lacked the abstract thinking necessary to think of the void as a number, attempted to use zero in their mathematics before they understood it fully, were unwilling to share the knowledge of zero with other European countries, focused so much on negative numbers that they couldn't imagine a number for the void. So this is F, right? It says right here that the concrete mind of the ancient Greeks could not conceive the void as a number, let alone endow the void with a symbol. So they were not comfortable with the abstract thinking that required this. The passage author most clearly indicates that he thinks his readers wouldn't be interested in hearing the story of how the Maya conceived of zero, what Danzig contributed to math, the long version of the story of zero, who drew the oval on the counting board in India. So it's C, right? Because he says that that's the short version, not a bad one. You don't want to hear the long version, right? So he assumes that they wouldn't be interested in hearing the long version of the story of zero. The statement zero lay rustling in the weeds for many centuries most nearly means that the concept of zero had far-reaching effects on math, existing long before it was articulated, had been developed and then forgotten, was initially rejected by mathematicians. So it's G because the idea of zero was there, right? The idea of a void was there, but it hadn't been articulated. The passage author responds to the US Library of Congress statement that there's never been a system of dates with the year zero by uh, arguing that undiscovered civilizations may have had year zero, citing an expert who disagrees with this, suggesting that the Library of Congress is just authoritative, providing an example that contradicts the statement. So I think it's D. Um, they knew something was wrong, right? And then he talks about the accession year, which kind of is year zero. So, yeah, so he provides an example. The passage author most clearly indicates that compared to other contemporary mathematicians' research, Kaplan's research is more. This comes from here. The most rigorous research, right? The most detailed research, most thorough, right? Thorough is rigorous and detailed. Speculative is something which doesn't come to a conclusion, so that's not correct. Okay, let's grade this. 11 DHAGD, DHAGD, and 16 FCGDH, FCGDH.